Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. This week is chapter 9, and it's week 11 of our class History of the World to 1500, which is History 1050. And I apologize for my casual dress today. It's a Saturday, and I'm getting this done while I'm inspired. So this week we're talking about African history to 1500, and if you kind of recall the organization of this class, the period of time we're in right now is this fall of the Roman Empire to 1000, 1500. So really kind of approaching the end of our time period, especially as we approach Africa. And the thing that's interesting about African history, I think for most of us who have studied Western history and have just touched upon it in our high school education, perhaps, or our readings, there's a lot of surprises for a lot of us when we read about Africa. And perhaps the one that's most surprising, the students who really don't know anything about ancient Africa, is the influence of Islam. And so we'll read a couple of stories in the chapter about, these great African kings with, all of this gold, who are, making the trip to the Hajj, for Islam. So in, at Mecca in the Middle East, so a long way to go with these huge trains of camels and gold and slaves. So it would have really been something to see. So there's a lot of fascinating history here. And one of the things the book talks about right off the bat is that, there wasn't a tradition of written history in Africa. It was all oral history. And I'll talk about that in addition here in 1 minute. But the histories that did come out of Africa were really written in the late 1800s and the early 1900s by Westerners, by Europeans, and anything written older than that about the Portuguese going into Africa, or any other European peoples. The histories that were written were very biased, and there's an interesting section in the book that talks about when books see Africans dressed up in traditional garb, it's like at a dance, a cultural dance, it's called a tribal dance. But at the same time, if you see Europeans dressed up in traditional garb dancing, it's called folk dancing. So it's the chapter gives us a glimpse of all of these sort of gotcha words when we're talking about stereotypes, when we're talking about race. And I think that's one of the important things to take out of this chapter. And I think that's one of the reasons this chapter is really outstanding, because it really gets us into this historiography. And I know we don't talk about historiography in undergrad classes, but when you get into grad school, if you're moving on in history, or if you're just going to be a history major, historiography refers to the study of the writing of history, sort of like where the authors were coming from at the time, mentally. What was their window to the world, and were they already biased about people whose skin was different color than theirs? So all of that stuff is wrapped up in African history, and it makes it a little bit difficult. And there's just so much going on, it makes it difficult. So one of the things this chapter did nicely, because you can't possibly cover hundreds of years of African history. It's not like it's the Roman Empire. You're talking an entire continent. So it's impossible to talk about it. So one of the things that the chapter does that I like is it breaks it down into these 4 major kingdoms and regions. And you'll see by a map that I'm going to show you in a minute, they're not the only ones, but it is what it is. So let me get into it, and I'll talk about what's on the quiz this week. It's really interesting. There's so many cool stories that come out of this, like the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, and the influence of Judaism, and just very cool. So try to read it all. I think it's a short chapter, and I think it's a pretty good one. So that's that. Like I said, look at the map. There's a map 9.1, and it sort of shows you the immensity of the African continent. I mean, you can get there's some maps online you can look, but you can get the United States, China, I think most of India, all in the same land mass, the same land mass as Africa. So it is a very big area. And the other thing the book talks about are all of the climates and the microclimates, ranging from the Sahara Desert in the north down in through the Congo, and then we're going to read a little bit about Great Zimbabwe and the Swahili coast. So that's on the east coast of the continent. So again, these entirely different climates, and some support agriculture, some don't. So check that out. I wanted to get back to this idea of the difficulty of writing African history that I mentioned in the beginning, that a lot of it was oral history. So one of the cool things is that there was a job, and it was probably men, and they were called griots or griots. It's probably French in origin, Griot, griot or griot. And these were people that were in charge of keeping the history, and it was all in their head. It was oral history, and they were also people that even remembered like laws, and legal documents. So if you think in terms of like a human database, or perhaps a professor with a lot of knowledge, that's what these griots were, and that's where the histories lived. And there's a saying in there, and there's a question about this on the quiz, that in Africa, when an old man dies, it's the same as a library burning, representing this idea that most of the history and most of the narrative, even the legal narrative, is in the head of people. It's remembered, and in this case, by wise men. And it, culturally, there's still that sort of stuff that goes on around the world. Like in South Korea, for example, historians are really valued. The knowledge that they bring is really valued, but not so much here, except for this class, I guess. So anyway, I digress. But anyway, quiz question about the griots. They're the guys who like kept the oral histories, and that's one of the reasons we don't have better African history. So check that out. What else is going on? We already talked about the bias involved, and the word tribe, and civilized and uncivilized. And I think we talked about that earlier in the semester. And so just something to keep in mind, because of course, considering the sensitivity to race, especially in the Western culture, African history is going to be difficult, and considering when it was written, it's going to be more difficult and more biased. So anyway, keep that in mind. So the first area of the 4 areas that the book talks about is Ethiopia. So the Ascom and Ethiopian states, if you will. And I mentioned that story about the Queen of Sheba, and it's sort of this Ethiopian text that the book talks about, called the Kebra Nagast, and it's the story of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon in Israel. Okay, so in the Middle East, and we studied. We read about King Solomon. So this idea that King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a child together, and what it did was this myth, or maybe it's not a myth. We don't know. Probably isn't actually tied together. The importance of the Middle Eastern civilization with the Ethiopians, and gave a status, if you will. Although most everybody converted to Islam, but again, you see this early connection between the Middle East and Africa, inner Africa, Ethiopia. So that's kind of cool. And again, there's a quiz question, because really when you read this section, it's kind of different, because the Queen of Sheba, who's actually Queen Makeda in Ethiopia, is like the only woman we read about in the entire chapter. So at least it's a little glimpse that demonstrates that women have some power in some areas of Africa at some time, but we need to know more, and we don't. So for now, there is a quiz question about her, Queen of Sheba, Queen Makeda, and the fact that she did have great power and was revered. So it's indicative that there was some flexibility or some power for women in some cases. So just kind of keep that in mind. And that's in the Ethiopian section. And then we go through the Western Sudan, and I'm smiling because the Western Sudan, there's this story about this guy, Mansa Musa, right? And he's like the richest guy ever, even today. And I think there's a link. Oh, I did. I put the link in there. There's a link to, I don't know where it goes, like Forbes magazine or something, but it sort of adjusts everything for inflation, what have you. And this guy, Mansa Musa, is still the richest guy ever. And the reason is that the Western Sudan and Mali, where he was at in particular, a lot of gold and salt trading went through there, and slaves too, but a lot of gold trading. And this is before the European slave trade. And I mean, he became like super wealthy because he collected a tax on all the gold. And you'll read about several kingdoms in the text with these kings that are just like have all this gold. Like I think it was Musa who, yeah, it was Musa who went to that, he was Islamic. So he went on the Hajj, right? Traveling to Mecca all the way from Mali, all the way you'd have to get to around the Sahara somehow, all the way from Mali all the way up to Mecca. And the book said that his caravan had 100 camels, 12,000 slaves, and 30,000 pounds of gold. And he gave out gold along the way because to him it was like no big deal, but everybody else is like, whoa. So anyway, that's kind of cool. There's a story in there that there's a quiz question in there also. There's a story in there about he gave out so much gold that it actually sort of downgraded the price of gold because all of a sudden there was this greater supply. So that's interesting. The quiz part of this is that the reason gold was such a big deal at that time is because some of these Middle Eastern empires that we read about, the Abbasids and these other empires, were starting to mint their own coins. And so they wanted gold for coinage in a lot of these Middle Eastern and even European empires. So gold was traded, or the trade of gold really emerged and really skyrocketed during this time. So that's why these guys got rich, because they taxed all of it or it came from their empires back in the day. So there's that. You'll read about Ghana. You'll read about, let's see, Mali, we already talked about. And we talked about Mansa Musa a little bit, the richest guy. And again, he was a big Muslim guy. So he built mosques and schools and got Muslim clerics and intellectuals in, and really sort of built up the Mali region. So, I mean, if you go there today to Africa and into Mali, but any of these areas we're talking about, you'll see the influence of Islam through any temples or churches or that sort of thing. And there's some good pictures in the book that you can look at. So coming out of the Western Sudan in the Songhai, again, sort of the same old thing. Muslims, a lot of gold, an empire that lasted for some period of time. And then we get into Great Zimbabwe, and there's a really good map right here. And Great Zimbabwe is actually down here in the lower corner of the map, be the lower to my right, I guess. And so that's Great Zimbabwe. And, we can see the Ethiopian culture that we talked about up here, and the Swahili coast we're going to talk about a little bit. So these are the Eastern Indian cultures. All right. So you had some Portuguese, but a lot of Arabic traders coming through this way. So, or by foot, because here's the Saudi peninsula right here, the Middle East. So look at that's really close right there. So anyway, you kind of get the layout for the land. And then Mali and Ghana are right up here. Okay, right in these circles. So to me, they look green, blue, and red. But for those of you who don't see color, they're up in the West Horn of Africa, if you will. So that's our cool map. We were talking about, let's see, where were we? We were talking about Great Zimbabwe. There's a question on the quiz about Great Zimbabwe because it is suggested that the decline of that state came about because of deforestation and overpopulation and overuse of resources. So there's a question in the quiz about, we can learn a lesson about sustainability by studying Great Zimbabwe. And again, these ideas that it was deforestation and overpopulation are suggested. There's no way to know it for sure, but most archaeologists think and have evidence of the fact that the resources were fairly depleted. So, I mean, it happened in London too. I mean, deforestation in England, in the 1600s. So it happens to societies, but in this case, it might have brought Great Zimbabwe down. So that's a quiz question. And then the chapter gets into Swahili and the biggie there. And I think something that's important. First of all, in the quiz, there's a question about the Zang, Z-A-N-G rebellion. So read about that section. It's in section 9.9 of our text, and it's about slaves, and it's a pretty good story. And then also read about the difference between the East Indian Ocean slave trade and the Western European slave trade, because it's significant and it's related to the Zang rebellion. And I think that the idea that the Eastern slave trade wasn't like, chattel slavery like was in the U.S. It was, there were actually laws protecting slaves. Slaves had some rights. Slaves were, not just locked in plantations. They were servants, musicians, artists, concubines in some cases. So it's really sort of a different world. And I don't know if you can make some assumptions from that or not. But because of slave rebellions, Persia and I would say the Middle East, that all of that area where Islam was so strong, slavery never really kind of caught on. There was a lot of hesitation from these rebellions, and because that in the Muslim world, you're always born free. So that's all I have. I'm sorry this went so long. I hope I covered all the quiz questions. I think I did. To read about the Zang, to know about sustainability in Great Zimbabwe, to know about women through the Queen of Sheba, and I don't know what else we covered. But again, the griots. So those were the guys that kept the history. So it's important to know that. And did I get everything? I got gender. If nothing else, you'll find your way through it. It's all open book and open note anyway. Have a great week. I hope everyone's doing great. And hey, the semester's kind of winding down, right? Not too much longer to go. So have a great week. If you have any questions, get in touch. Take care now. Bye-bye.